Hello, BookTube, and hello, AuthorTube. I saw a video yesterday that has been sticking in my craw ever since I saw it, so I thought I would talk about it a little with you. And I'm pretty sure that if I saw it, you saw it, because the video was by Hank Green. And Hank Green and his brother John Green and their channel, the Vlogbrothers, and their many satellite channels, pretty much invented YouTube as we know it today. They are major movers and shakers on the platform that we all share. And I confess, I've always had a problem with both of them. Mainly with John Green, because he was the only author. Hank Green just recently wrote his first novel, which we will get to. But with both of them, in addition to John Green's novels, there was also their endless hours of YouTube videos that I have watched. I've watched a huge number of their videos, and there's always been a problem. Something that's always bothered me about them has been the radical disconnect between the intelligence of their content on YouTube and both the affect of their delivery, this kind of hapless, I might not even really know what I'm talking about, when they clearly do and they clearly know they do, and also the just flagrant, just tornado alarm in the afternoon stupidity of John Green's YA novels. There's always been what I've seen as a radical disconnect between the intelligence of the people involved and the level at which their product is pitched. That has always bugged me. It has always struck me that there's only one thing that can possibly explain that discrepancy, and that is crass and very duplicitous marketing to what they perceive as their enormous base of YAs, of young adults, who I guess they might perceive that way, maybe even have molded to be that way. One way or another, it has been my problem with everything that John Green has written, and then Hank Green wrote his book, an absolutely remarkable thing, last year, and it became an immediate New York Times bestseller, not because of advertising on the part of his publisher, and not because of word of mouth, because of the contents of the book, but rather because these are the founders of Nerdfighteria. These are the Vlogbrothers. Hank Green or John Green could staple together their receipts from Costco, and it would be a New York Times bestseller. In fact, it would have millions of pre-orders before it ever saw the light of day, even if the description said, this is just a bunch of mimeographed receipts from Costco. So on the one hand, you have Hank Green very demonstrably following in his brother's footsteps by writing really stupid YA. An absolutely remarkable thing is a noticeably stupid book. It's loaded with hot take of the minute cliches. It's crammed with needless and pointless forced obscenity. The characters are one-dimensional and idiotic. Don't take my word for it. Probably a lot of you are young enough so that you grew up with the Vlogbrothers. Probably you have a soft spot in your heart for them. I don't deny that to you at all. I totally support that. A huge amount of the content that these two make is fantastic, and their underlying message to young people, I might quibble with it just a bit. Their underlying message is, of course, don't forget to be awesome. Which the implication of which is that you're already awesome, but in your hurry to do this, that, or the other thing, you might forget about it, and you should remember that. And naturally, the Boston Irish Catholic in me disagrees with that, because you have to work to be awesome. It's not just, it doesn't come to you just by breathing. There are plenty of people who aren't awesome. There are plenty of people who are jerks. You have to work not to be one. There are plenty of people who are stupid. You should work not to be stupid. I myself think there's no salvation without faith and works. So don't forget to be awesome. It bugs me just a little, but the affirmation of it I've always approved of, and I love how much nonfiction material, how much history and science breakdowns they get out to the world. Massive amounts of view counts on material that, if anybody else did it, wouldn't get that kind of attention. And they don't need to. They could easily do all sorts of content, or none at all, that was anything like that. So if you have a soft spot for them, I respect that completely. But nevertheless, don't take my word for it. Go and find a copy of An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. Your library, which probably doesn't have the collected works of Trollope, will definitely have 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 copies of An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. Check it out and read it. I firmly believe that you will say, okay, I have liked some YA, I am a fan of YA, and this is really, really bad YA. So naturally, it perked up my attention when I saw a video from Hank Green entitled 8 Things I Wish I Knew When I Was Writing My First Novel. And if it perked up my attention, then it perked up the attention of literally millions of young people who are going to click on this video in order to learn what they can about what Hank Green wishes he knew when he was writing his first novel. In other words, his advice to you for writing your first novel. And stuff that, by implication of the title, he has battle-tested with experience. So these aren't random ideas. These are things he knows are true. It is poised for maximum imitatability among his extremely biddable young audience. And oh my God, BookTube. The video is less than 4 minutes long and has some of the most intensely concentrated bad writing advice I have ever seen. So I want to respond to it because I mean a random video of his on just unstructured thoughts for 4 minutes routinely gets more views in 1 hour than my channel is ever likely to get in the history of the world. But even so, I can't let this go because YouTube is a platform of call and response. I saw this video and was fuming the whole time because not just because this guy, I mean, he's fairly young, he might learn otherwise, but not just because he seems to have gotten all the wrong lessons out of his first novel, but also because he seems intent on passing along those wrong lessons to lots of other people. So you can consider this kind of my tiny little counterpoint. And we'll go through the list of the 8 things just like he did. And number 1 is character versus plot. And he says that he started with a plot for his novel and it barely got him anywhere. It turns out he discovered in writing his book that he has to care about his characters as though they were friends of his. That's what got him to the end of his book. Not a plot, but caring about his characters. He says that his writing motivation tip for this realization number 1 is to fall in love with your characters. And you can see already what is wrong with that. Something enormous is wrong with that. The only way that you're going to love your characters as friends, the only way you're going to fall in love with them is if they're all lovable. Which will inevitably make your YA, the resulting YA novel, an example of all that's worst in the current 21st century YA, which is entirely self-affirming, entirely emotionally validating, no character arcs, no growth, no villains, no nothing like that. The bad YA is like that. Everybody's just a tiny bit misunderstood, and they're all a little bit quirky and a little bit dorky, and they're all, in the end, honorary members of Nerdfighteria. In other words, no dramatic tension whatsoever. And that's the only way, that's the only book you're going to produce if your starting requirement is that you love all of your characters. And what does the first nanosecond of this point say? Dispense with the idea of plotting. We're going to come back to that. Point number 2, thing number 2 that he wished he knew when he was writing his debut novel is about writing schedules. And he says that writing schedules do not work for him. I guess this is meant to underscore how busy he is, and I'm sure that he is busy, but as I've mentioned on this channel before, and as better writers than I have mentioned in the past, writing is either something that you want to do seriously or it isn't. And if it is something that you want to do seriously, you will rearrange your life in order to do it seriously. Instead, what does Hank Green say? He says that his writing goal is 1,000 words a week. 1,000 words a week. He says if he does anything less than that, then he's really not writing his novel anymore, and he just feels disconnected from it. And it'll sometimes be weeks or months until he gets back into it. No, what he really needs to do is have his nose to the grindstone for 2 solid hours. He said that 1,000 words represents about 2 hours of writing for him. He needs to do at least 2 solid hours of writing a week. Again, this is horrific advice. Just horrific. If you think that you're too busy to do more than 1,000 words a week on your novel, I would be happy to introduce you to the life stories of probably 3 or 4 or 5 dozen famous novelists who had a lot more to do than you do and managed to do a lot more work than that. If it's Hank Green, I wouldn't need to introduce him to those authors because he's done classroom YouTube presentations on almost all of them. 1,000 words a week is really bad writing advice. That is Hank Green, an idol to millions, telling them that if that's a goal of yours, you're doing okay. No, no, no. If you're writing a novel and you are serious about it, a bare minimum of 2,000 words a day, a bare minimum of that. 1,000 words a week, you are a dabbler. No other way to put it. It's just flat out bad advice. You won't get any better at what you're doing if you do it that seldom. And we're going to come back to that as well, because as you'll notice in these points, most of them contradict each other. But point number 3 is the one that bothered me the most, because it's the kitchen soup version of writing, and it is totally wrong. I have been fighting against this forever, and to hear someone as prominent as him come right out and say it was extra annoying. It is that not all writing is writing. He says thinking, staring, researching, stressing, reading other people's books, rereading your own book, pauses, and then looks right at the camera and says, all of that is writing. All of that stuff is writing. That is totally wrong. Staring, stressing, rereading your own stuff because it came out really good or you're not really sure about it, none of that is writing. Writing is writing. Writing is writing. Not anything else. All the rest of that stuff is not writing. He says that this quote just kills me. I'd tear out my hair if I had any hair to spare. He says, if you're super focused on word count, you'll have more words. If you're super focused on story, you'll have more story. And pray tell, what will the story be composed of? Where's it going to be? How are you going to prove that you have it if you haven't written it? It sounds so good, doesn't it? It's such a hallmark quote. If you concentrate on word count, you'll have more words. Implication being words are empty, soulless things without a story. But if you concentrate on your story, you'll have more story. Without writing, your staring will get you more story. How's that going to work? It isn't going to work. It isn't. It just sounds good. It's just a hallmark sentiment that sounds good. The only thing that will get you more story is to clothe your story in words. And the only thing that will get you more words is if you're paying attention to your word count. Writing is writing. It is producing material. It is generating material. That is the absolute sine qua non. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. Staring, stressing is not writing. And yet, how many young people, having watched this video and maybe rewatched it, maybe taken notes, I took notes too, but for a different purpose. How many of them are going to come out of this video and say, wow, so, well, this morning I had my computer open, I had my draft open, I just stared into space, but according to Hank Green, I was writing that whole time. Oh, I just hated to see it. I hate even repeating it. Where are we here? Thing number 4. Here's where we start to get into the explicit contradictions. The quote that opens it is, nothing but time writes a book. That is not true. That is not true. Ask anybody. Ask George R.R. Martin. Ask Hilary Mantel if simple time gets a book written. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Time does not get a book written. There's only one thing that gets a book written, and that is writing. Time does not do it. What did he say? He said if it takes hundreds of hours at least, but if you don't spend the time, it doesn't get done. Okay, what did you just say in your previous point? You said that staring and stressing and reading other people's books counts as writing. Now you're saying if you don't spend the time on writing, you'll never get it done. Well, which is it? I agree, but which is it? Point number 5, it has to do with plotting. And he says that when he wrote his first book, plotting for him was a constant process of retconning, where he would get himself into a blind alley or something that contradicted something that had gone earlier, and he'd have to rewrite it. He'd have to go back and rewrite it, make separate folders, work it out into constantly retconning the story as it went along. And out loud, to the screen, while I was watching him, I said, that's because you didn't plot. That's why it was retconning, because you don't have any idea what you're doing. And maybe in your very first thing that you learned when you were writing your first novel, maybe if the very first thing you did in this whole video was to throw out the idea of plotting, maybe if that wasn't true, maybe instead you'd plotted the whole thing from beginning to end, then maybe you wouldn't be doing quite so much retconning, which is a waste of time. I mean, your retconning is you poring over and torturing pages that are already written. You wouldn't have to do that if you plotted a little more. And we're going to see that plot is an element in this anyway. All of these things contradict each other. So I wish that he had learned better things from writing his first novel. Because question number 6 is the characters have to be in control. Now, this has nothing to do with plotting. We're going to come back to plotting in the next one. This is just as bad. And how many authors' interviews have you heard say this? Oh, well, I don't tell my characters what to do. They tell me what to do. I don't even know what they've got on their minds. I just sort of follow along and take dictation. How many times have you heard an author say something as ridiculous as that? And haven't you always wanted to throw a little soup at them when they hear it? That's what he says. The characters have to be in control. So the quote is, if I'm controlling them, then they aren't real and they're not going to feel real. They're characters in a novel. They're not real. And saying the characters have to be in control is just a highfalutin way of saying I don't want to work as hard as I need to. If I work a little harder, then I will not only control my characters, but I will also make them feel like they're not being controlled. Their spontaneity on the page will come out the other end of even more work on my part, not less work. It's not that I hazily invent some of these characters and just watch them do things. That is not satisfying. That is not storytelling. And yet, he's not the this is the one case where I'm willing to absolve him partly, because he's not the only author that I've heard say this kind of nonsense. But it's incredibly corrosive for somebody who's starting a book on their own. What are they going to think? Once they have a strong character, well, I should just sit back and let them do the driving? No. Better by far to take the approach that Muriel Spark took about her characters when she was asked this anile question by an interviewer who said, do you find that your characters take control of your book? And she scoffed at the idea and said, my characters don't cross the street unless I tell them to. And that's the way it should be. That's absolutely the way it should be, unless you're writing bad YA. But we go on to point number 7, thing number 7 that he wished he'd learned when he was writing his first book, and that is that you don't have to write linearly. You can jump ahead, you can stop and start. Like, for instance, he mentions in this point that if you're building up to a big scene and it isn't working, the elements aren't working, and you get to the big scene and it's a dud, then you can skip it, move on to some other big scene or some other part of the story and come back to that later. In other words, you can fix these things in modular form. Now, the first thought that came to my mind is that contradicts the idea of no plotting. If you have these big scenes and you already know about them, then you are in favor of plotting, and you ought to say that. Your millions of listeners will profit more from your video if you tell them to plot than if you tell them not to. If you tell them to fall in love with their characters instead, that's doing them a misservice. And it turns out that he doesn't really believe it, because this point, you don't have to write linearly, wouldn't be possible if he weren't plotting his books. You wouldn't know what the big scenes were. You wouldn't know what the big beats were of the dramatic arc. On one level, at least a little, I might agree. Temporarily, lightly, I might agree that if you get to one of those big nodules, one of those big dramatic moments in your book, something that parts of that section have been leading up to, and you're writing it and that scene doesn't work, I might agree with the subtext of this point, which is, don't stress about it. Don't force it. If you get to that scene that you've been waiting and building up for so long and it's just not working, I might agree. Go on to something else. Skip the scene. If you already know what's going to happen in it, skip to the aftermath and start writing that and go back. When the time is right for that scene, maybe that will work. I agree with that, but this point, I only agree with this point by reworking his first point, which is plot. Plot your stories. If you're not plotting your stories, if you're just flying by the seat of your pants because you like your characters, then what separates you from someone who's not a storyteller? What separates you from somebody who's not asking money for the end product? Nothing. Storytellers are people who've made stories to tell. You'd think that would go without saying, but apparently not. And then the last thing, and number 8, the 8th thing that he wished that he knew when he was writing his first novel is that he has expertises and passions in a whole bunch of different areas. He lists a few of them. And that it was open windows in the summer. We're going to get summer noises. He calls it deeply enabling. He says it was deeply enabling the moment that he realized that those expertises could be a strength in his book. And once again, I totally disagree. Not so much with the words that he's saying. Of course, every writer has strengths, and writers should use their strengths. That's sort of a truism. But because I disagree with it because of the subtext of what he's saying, which is that his book should be a mimeograph imprint of his own idiosyncrasies, instead of an attempt on his part as an author to create a world separate from himself. And having read this point and remembering an absolutely remarkable thing, I can say he definitely applied this lesson. He did know this when he was writing his first book, because an absolutely remarkable thing is a Hank Green monologue from start to finish. Every character sounds like Hank Green. Every problem, every concentration, every resolution, they're all Hank Green things. It sounds like something that would come straight out of his channel. And it shouldn't. It shouldn't. Because you don't know how many of your readers will exist long after your channel is gone. Because your book shouldn't be adjacent to your stardom on YouTube. All of those things, all of those becauses. If this manuscript, an absolutely remarkable thing, had been submitted completely blind to any agent in New York, they would have turned it down with laughter. Not maybe laughter directed at the author, but definitely amongst themselves. They would have said, can you believe some of the stuff that we're being asked to consider? Only reason that this thing got a contract, and the only reason that it became a New York Times bestseller, is because John and Hank Green have a built-in audience. These lessons, these 8 things that Hank Green wishes he knew before he wrote his first novel, and the depressing corollary is that it seems obvious that he's going to apply these things to his next book, and I wish I could sit him down in a room for a minute and say, don't do that. Don't apply any of these things to your next book. This is a less than 4-minute concentrated blueprint on how to write bad fiction. So don't do any of these things. Plot your novel. Don't fall in love with your characters. Your goal should be to elicit an emotional reaction to your characters on the part of your reader. Not you, your reader. This is your creation. These aren't real people. You're making a story that you would hope, I assume, will last. Will be written, will be read generations from now. Yes, you have interests and passions. You have eccentricities. Yes, of course, it's going to be hard to keep them out of a novel that you write. But you shouldn't be embracing that, especially if you're doing it across the board. All of his characters are Hank Green. And presumably, since these are the things he learned in writing his first book, all of his characters in his next book will be Hank Green. And maybe that makes sense. That would certainly substantiate the theories that I have around that discrepancy that I started talking about at the beginning of this video. The gigantic discrepancy between the intelligence of these people when you hear them talk versus the written words that they produce for public consumption. There's an enormous gap between those two things. The men themselves are articulate, intelligent, perfectly aware of nuance, funny in all sorts of ways, not just in junior high ways. And the YA stuff, I mean, on one level, I'm sure that they are justifying by saying, you know, I'm writing for the conventions of a genre. But you and I have both read YA. That is very much YA. It's not crossing any line into new adult or adult fiction. We have all read YA that doesn't read like that. That doesn't pander. That doesn't read like it's a hug fest in junior high. We've all read good YA. The YA that these guys produce is bad YA. Syrupy, slangy, pan-shallow, bad YA. And these 8 points are a perfect recipe for how to do that. Don't plot, fall in love with your characters, staring out the window is writing 1,000 words a week. All right, well, I've vented. I have vented. I know that that I don't make as many writing videos as I should. I would like to do that, but I couldn't let this go by. I guess I want to end by stressing, those of you who have seen his video, I'm sure that it's been suggested by YouTube's algorithm to almost everybody on BookTube, because we're all involved with books. And these two have done a great amount for books, a great amount for literacy, a great amount for creating a whole generation of young people who have been told by 2 adults they respect that it is perfectly okay to be themselves. That is a priceless lesson. And I don't want to undercut that at all. What I want is for the fiction that they write to be every bit as good as the sentiments that they convey in other genres. That's all. Maybe that's a lot to ask. But if they're not talented enough to do that, maybe they ought not to... Anyway, I wanted to stress, for those of you who have seen this video, it's been suggested to you on YouTube, and maybe I don't know, maybe I should link to it. Maybe that sounds like a bit of bullying to do that, although Hank Green doesn't know I exist and is never going to know I exist, and wouldn't be bullied by me anyway with my paltry subscriber count and my tiny little dog. He probably has gigantic German Shepherds. But the point that I wanted to make to those of you who've seen that video or who might see it is is pretty simple, which is don't follow any of these points. The title, what was it again? 8 Things I Wish I Knew When I Was Writing My First Novel, heavily implies that you should know these things too when you're writing yours. The heavy implication of the title is that he's intending to save you time. Don't make the mistakes he made. And the point that I want to make is that almost everything that he lists in this video is a mistake. These aren't the corrections to mistakes. These are the mistakes. So don't do them. Don't do them. Watch Hank Green when he talks about YouTube censorship or the news of the day or any of the crash courses. Watch these people to your heart's content. But in this particular case, oh my, how I wish. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, now that I've vented, because as usual, you've done me the great courtesy of simply being a captive audience while I do that. I'll go back to talking about books right away, and maybe a little more writing as well, because we've got a lot of writing to do this summer and gearing up for NaNoWriMo. But anyway, I'm going to stop for now. I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.